This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Welcome to the Toronto Region Board of Trade's HitGo podcast. I'm the board's president and CEO, Jan De Silva. We hope you caught our first episode and are back for another lively climate economy conversation. In this mini-series, we're tackling tough, complex pieces of the climate puzzle. Today's piece is electric vehicle readiness. It's one thing to encourage consumers to buy a Prius or a Tesla, but what about the infrastructure and the industrial side of these vehicles? That's a lot. To reach net zero by 2050, we've got to be all hands on deck. EVs are a cornerstone of cleantech adoption, and our panel is a perfect example of this get-it-done mentality. You'll hear from three experts from different vantage points in the EV story. There's Travis Allen, the Chief Legal and Public Affairs Officer at Flow. Flow's a leader in charging with a network across the US and Canada. There's Cara Clairman, the President and CEO, Plug and Drive, which is a nonprofit that promotes EVs. And Katherine Sparkes, Director, Innovation, Research and Development at the Independent Electricity System Operator. The IESO is the government agency responsible for operating our electricity market. As always, our host is Craig Rutan, an alumnus of the board and passionate climate policy expert. In this episode, he'll tease out a clearer definition of readiness for EV adoption, ask panelists to identify and prioritize challenges in this space, and have them share leadership lessons from other jurisdictions and much more. We hope you enjoy it.
I wanted to start with a question for all of you to really set the table here. So, Travis, if you want to answer the question first, to you, what does being ready for EV adoption mean? And what are one or two main challenges that we should be focusing on to improve readiness in the Toronto region?
Sure, thank you. I think when it comes to readiness for EV adoption, people tend to think in terms of obviously the vehicles being there and understanding the vehicles. So there's an educational component. But the one that can really challenge adoption is the deployment of infrastructure. And we have to make sure basically that Ontarians who want to drive EVs can charge. And that means that they have to be able to charge where they park at night. It also means that they need to be able to charge on the road on their way to work or to education or to recreational activities. That's really sort of the criteria that most consumers are thinking about when they're deciding whether or not they can make the transition to an EV. So the big challenge is, can we make sure that we have enough charging infrastructure in place to help all Ontarians feel comfortable making that switch? And I think there's a lot to do there, but it's also a very hopeful issue because there's a really great roadmap from other jurisdictions that have deployed more charging, and Ontario has already made some really important progress as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Travis. Katherine, for you, what does being ready for EV adoption mean?
Yeah, so from the IESO's perspective, as the electricity system operator here in Ontario and the organization that's responsible for maintaining the reliability of Ontario's electricity system, it's really about ensuring that we can maintain the reliability, affordability, and sustainability of Ontario's electricity system to power those electric vehicles and the associated electricity demand from the electric vehicle manufacturers and supply chain participants that are looking to and starting to set up shop here in Ontario. So in December of last year, we published our Pathways to Decarbonization report in response to a request from the Minister of Energy here in Ontario to look at how we could decarbonize Ontario's electricity system by 2050, considering growing demand for electricity associated with transportation electrification and the electrification of a number of other end uses, as well as just growing economy as well. And so to meet the forecasted demand associated with more electric vehicles and the electrification of space heating and industrial processes, our Pathways report identified a need for an additional 69,000 megawatts of non-emitting electricity supply by 2050. To put that in perspective, that's like doubling the amount of generation that we have here in Ontario today. So that's a significant amount of new resources that we're going to need to meet the growing demand for electric vehicles, electrification, and decarbonization. So that's going to require a significant investment to build out the system in order to meet those demands. So the challenge from our perspective is really ensuring that we have sufficient, affordable, reliable, clean energy to meet the needs of vehicle electrification and broader decarbonization and electrification goals.
Thanks for sharing that, and I know we'll want to get into that deeper later. First, Cara, over to you on what you think about when you think about EV readiness.
Sure. Well, of course, my friends Katherine and Travis have highlighted some really important EV readiness goals that we have to reach in order to make it possible. And I think Travis sort of hinted at the issue of the vehicles need to be there. And I think maybe I'd just elaborate on like the issue of supply right now. It's great to have goals, but we don't really have here in Ontario in particular, we are challenged to get the vehicles. And so there's a supply chain issue. And of course, this is actually true for gas cars as well. It's not just electric cars, but it's more pronounced when it comes to electric cars. And so, and certainly we do see that Quebec and British Columbia seem to get a greater share of the vehicles that come to Canada. And so we are hopeful that the federal ZEV mandate will help sort of level the playing field across the country. So that's one thing. And then the other thing Travis, I think, also hinted at is education. I mean, there still is a pretty big gap in terms of people's understanding of these vehicles, and they won't just automatically make the switch because the vehicles are available. So we need to help them understand the benefits and realize that an EV can fit into most people's lives, not everyone, but most people, and help them with that experience so that when they are ready to buy, that they make the choice to go electric.
Thank you. Yeah. So there's obviously a lot of work to do across the board for continuing to improve EV readiness, but it sounds like we're at least getting some good steps down on the road. I want to dive a bit more into the charging infrastructure side. We heard from Katherine about the electricity grid, the scale of that challenge, but needing to double the electricity supply we have in the province. What's the scale of the investment we're looking at on the charging infrastructure side?
The scale is pretty significant. So if you look at the most recent Statistics Canada data on new electric vehicle sales, we're seeing a 43% increase year over year, just from last year for quarter three. And in some provinces like British Columbia, for example, they're now getting close to 1/5 of new vehicles sold. So we have moved from the world of sort of theoretical, what will happen when the wave comes, to the world where right now we are starting to see very significant adoption of zero emission vehicles. And particularly as we move from early adopters to what I would call sort of more mass market consumers who have expectations of convenience and reliability in all of their interactions with charging, it's changing the game, and it's creating a very significant demand for public charging infrastructure to be deployed basically everywhere that people are parking for significant amounts of time. So we're talking many, many millions of dollars to hundreds of millions of dollars really to deploy charging infrastructure. Ontario has recently announced $91 million for charging infrastructure. There's been long-standing investments from the federal government, particularly NRCan, but also CIB has recently announced some significant programs, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, I should say. So there are big government programs that are looking at helping to solve this issue. But I would say that that's early stages and there's still a lot more to do.
Thanks, Travis. Cara, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to build on that. Of course, there is a big need for more charging infrastructure, but just sort of feeding into Katherine's point about the grid, I mean, we certainly want people to charge as much as they can off peak because, of course, we know that that's better for the grid, it's better for the environment. it's cheaper, it's better in every way. And so that means people have to be able to charge where they live overnight. And so the biggest challenge I see is like for people with a single family home, it's relatively easy. It's not that expensive to install. And that's why you see that as the early adopters typically live in single family homes. Where the big challenge for a city like Toronto is multi-unit. And so I'm really pleased to see like what the federal government's NRCan's program is putting some funding towards multi-unit, not just public charging. And I personally would like to see more of an effort there as sort of job one. Although I agree with Travis, we do need public charging and we do need workplace charging. But of course, if we overkill it there, that means people will charge during the day, which is actually not something we want in terms of grid readiness.
Thanks, Cara. Let's pick up on that point on grid readiness. Katherine, when we think about the rollout of charging, I know the IESO handles the provincial system. How much of this is about, solutions that you can put in place or are thinking about at the provincial level versus some of those local companies like a Toronto Hydro or an Electra?
Yeah, I think the solution is really, it's really both. I mean, when you hear people in the sector talk, they're talking about, it's this, it's and, right? It's not one solution or another. We really are going to need all of the, the clean energy supply, demand management solutions when we think about the magnitude of the challenge, not only to meet the needs of electricity for electric vehicles and the associated manufacturing, but also for broader economic electrification and decarbonization. So it's going to be both those traditional large-scale transmission-connected resources that folks think of, large hydro, nuclear. It's also going to be smaller-scale distribution-connected resources, including those cited with customers. And we know that there are many communities and individual customers, homes, businesses across the province that are willing and want to cite different solutions at their locations, and are also willing to have these assets, have electric vehicles, contribute to the solution. So we don't see them as just part of a challenge, but when we look at when we kind of look at the fleet that's coming, and in our 2022 annual planning outlook published also in December, we assumed that we will meet the federal target that Cara identified earlier in terms of all light-duty cars and trucks being zero emissions by 2035. So when we look at that target being achieved, what that means from an electricity demand perspective is that electricity used for transportation is going to grow an average of 17% per year through 2043. We had about 71,000 electric passenger vehicles on the road in 2021. We're forecasting 7.3 million by 2043. So that's a significant, jump. 7.3 million electric passenger vehicles is also 7.3 million mobile batteries, right, that are capable of being aggregated together to store energy, to shift when they charge through good rate structures and price structures, and even procurements that we would undertake that could enable them to realize value for doing that, and they can even inject back to homes, right, and businesses. That's been a big selling feature of some of the EV manufacturers is use your truck to power your home for 5 days, right? So we're not just seeing them as a challenge to be solved, but also part of the solution as well.
I wanted to pick up on something that both Katherine and Cara have mentioned, which is specifically the interface between charging at home and the distribution grid. This is one of the biggest challenges that jurisdictions across North America are facing, and I love how Katherine framed it as an opportunity rather than just a problem or a challenge, because I really think that's the right approach. And we get so excited as a company when we see regulators and folks involved in the electrical system who make that leap. One piece of information that I think is helpful. So we make one of the most commonly used home charging stations in Canada. And what you typically see in very concrete terms is that people tend to plug in when they get home, if they have home charging, at around 5 or 6 p.m. And they are not unplugging their vehicle until 6, 7 in the morning when they leave. But a normal driver who's driving under normal commuting conditions in a place like Toronto is only needing to charge for about 2 to 4 hours based on sort of average driving distances. That is such a huge opportunity for the grid. Like, we do not need most drivers to be charging at 5 or 6 p.m. at night when they're also running their air conditioning and maybe cooking and watching TV. Like, they can be charging in the middle of the night. And as Cara said, there's huge grid benefits and cost benefits to that. And that is such a big opportunity for our grid and for integrating way more people at a cost-effective way and pushing back some of those distribution system constraints. And so I get really excited about that issue because I really think that's one of the emerging areas in this area.
Yeah, and I just add to that, totally agree with Travis, and it is a huge opportunity. I mean, right now, a lot of us early adopters were sort of what I would call, electricity geeks. So we do it already, even when there's no incentive to do it, or there is time of use pricing, but it's not so significant. But many of us can set our car, because our car is super smart, to only charge after, I usually set it for midnight, but after 7 p.m. when the price drops and when, the demand on the grid is less. But, as we get more into a mainstream audience that might not be people who are aware that this is an important thing to do, we're going to need to send those price signals strongly. And I was happy to see that there is going to be sort of a ultra low nighttime rate in Ontario that's being introduced that I hope will, encourage people to charge at the time that it's best for the grid.
Just picking up on what Cara said in terms of mainstreaming, I think, it's just to be clear, it's not just sort of us electricity system planners and operators who are excited about this potential and this opportunity. In the last 4 months, if you've been following the news, or if you even just on your TV, right? I alluded to Ford's campaign for the F-150 and using the truck to charge, your job site, right, or your home, right, during an event or whatever. But you're seeing other big auto manufacturers getting into this space too, right? Tesla, GM launched very publicly, right? Energy solutions over the last few months. So it really is now, it's happening today, right? That these opportunities are starting to be realized. And so the opportunity is in front of us to manage this growth, right? And in real time, using the source of the growth, the electric vehicles, as part of the solution. And I think that's incredibly exciting. And we'll have huge benefits for ratepayers too when we think about cost management and reliability.
This is fantastic hearing you all unpack the opportunities here and how all of these different problems really interlink together and create some interesting new solutions we can lean on. We're hearing about some of the pieces that are already happening, like creating the ultra-low overnight electricity rate and the start of charging rollout happening, some federal funds available. Is there anything we can do right now to really, supercharge the direction that we're heading in, or who should we be looking at, the most right now to really exercise some leadership and get the ball moving even faster in this direction?
So one of the things I think that, it's important for everyone to remember is that we have experience with significant energy transitions here in Ontario, right? As a province, we phased out coal a number of years ago, and we're one of the first jurisdictions in the world to do so. And so we should, as Ontarians, be really proud that we have an electricity system that's, well over 90% emissions free, right? And that's an incredible base to grow from. And it's an incredible base to attract, frankly, electric vehicle manufacturers and the associated manufacturers in the supply chain, right, vis-a-vis some of the other areas they might set up. Like, it really is a significant advantage from the perspective of attracting new manufacturing. So that's something that all Ontarians should be proud of. It also demonstrates that we can do something challenging, really challenging together, right? And really, I think that's about the work of the government and policymakers, working with the regulator, working with us at the ISO, working with local distribution companies who have a significant role from the perspective of distribution management, obviously working with EV owners and EV manufacturers. So I really think it's an all hands on deck collaborative effort that's going to enable us to make sure that this transition to an electrified transportation system happens in a way that's cost effective, that maintains reliability, that's accessible to all.
I can share some thoughts as well, really building on what Katherine said. I mean, there's in jurisdictions we've seen that have achieved really impressive EV adoption, it is exactly that. It's an all hands approach. It is multi-level. So you've got, the federal government and now the province has indicated it's planning to provide some funding for charging. That's a huge part. It helps to create consumer interest and assuage consumer concerns when you get a nicely deployed public charging network that covers a lot of the province. There's a lot of work to be done on those folks that are living in sort of multifamily contexts, like Cara mentioned, who can't easily charge in a detached garage. There's a lot of work to be done there in places like Toronto and other major cities. And then I think it's really important to highlight the role of utilities and the Ontario Energy Board or the OEB, because utilities play a really significant role in the speed and the cost of deploying public and residential charging. Their connection processes matter a great deal to companies like ours because it can influence how fast we're able to get chargers in the ground. And the economics of charging really depend on rate structures. And I promise not to get super granular on rate structures, but I'll just tell you that if you look at the provinces that have the best EV adoption, they have changed their rate structures to support charging economics. Demand charges is what it's called. And both BC and Quebec have done it. And it makes a very big difference. It really does help get private capital deployed. So that's important. And then I would say, municipalities have a huge role to play. Toronto has been a real leader in green building standards. Vancouver and some of the other BC municipalities have done amazing things getting buildings ready, at least new buildings for EV charging to make things easier on people that live in condos and apartments. And now we're starting to look at their parking lots, and the curbside is a huge resource for getting more charging alternatives. And I think that's going to be really important as well.
Well, I don't have much to add there except to say I totally agree that it's all hands on deck and we can't look to any one player to sort of solve this for us. I mean, we're all, the private sector and governments at all levels, and including municipal. There's a lot municipal governments can do. And I think, for example, Toronto has its green standard in terms of condos and development. And I mean, of course, we'd love to see this be actually enshrined in the building code. But for now, Toronto can require everyone that builds a new building in Toronto to follow certain requirements of EV readiness. And so, I mean, I really agree with both Travis and Katherine that we have to sort of take the efforts of all to make this happen. And and finally, I just think we need to prioritize a little bit, because of course, as much as we can say, yeah, let's all do it, I mean, there are sometimes funding limitations. So we should be figuring out what are the highest priority items.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Learning a lot about where we're at right now and who we need to be looking at as the leaders here. I'd like to look at this for a second from the perspective of the manufacturers. We have, billions in investment that have been secured in Ontario for manufacturing electric vehicles and batteries and starting to build out that supply chain. From their perspective, you'd think it'd be important to make sure that those vehicles can get on the roads here and that they can sell those vehicles here. What is the perspective from the manufacturing side of the equation, and how invested are they in ensuring the region is EV ready?
I can take a crack at that. I mean, certainly I couldn't give you the inner scoop about the perspective of the manufacturers. But I think, the first point that needs to be made is what a huge success. Like, it is just amazing what the province of Ontario and their federal partners have been able to pull off in terms of attracting manufacturing jobs in this growing sector and building jobs for Ontarians. It's incredible. It's exciting. And I think it has really turned the public view on this industry in a real way, far beyond sort of some of the original groups of folks that were really interested in electrification, because people are seeing that electrification means good jobs and it means economic growth for the province. And so that's really exciting. What I can tell you is that I am seeing significant investments being made by a number of the large OEMs to help build charging infrastructure across North America. They've seen what has happened with Tesla, and everyone will tell you Tesla has done an amazing job at building out, charging infrastructure that is both very conveniently located and it's also highly reliable. And what we've started to see with recent announcements from GM, Mercedes has also made some announcements recently, is that they are also getting into the game of funding charging infrastructure. And some of the things that they've been emphasizing thematically is making sure that there is access for everybody across North America. So GM is really focused on providing charging stations in communities all across North America in partnership with their dealerships. And they've also really been focusing on reliability. So making sure that the network actually works when people pull up to a charging station. That was an issue that has definitely plagued the industry in the early days. So those seem to be some of the elements that are being emphasized in public releases.
And I would just add to Travis's point that, it's a huge success. It's amazing. It's an amazing jobs creation strategy, job maintenance strategy. What it isn't is an EV adoption strategy. And so we do still need to do more things. And of course, the OEMs investing in infrastructure is fantastic as well. But what I think is missing here in Ontario is, we don't have the incentive structure that exists in some of the other provinces. And so when automakers are deciding where to put their vehicles, their limited supply that they've got, they'll go to British Columbia and Quebec. And so we want to make sure that Ontario gets its share. And by the way, the United States has these great incentives now too. And a lot of the vehicles manufactured in Windsor, in Oakville, it's great, but those vehicles could all end up in the United States. And so we will have to do something different. I'm not saying incentives are the only thing we can do, but we are going to have to do something if we want to make sure that the vehicles being manufactured here get bought by Canadians.
Let me just pick up on that for a second, Cara, and ask for your thoughts on, what are some of the pros and cons or the differences between an incentive-based approach and you mentioned earlier, the zero-emission vehicle mandate that the federal government's talking about and that I believe is in place in some provinces already. And, what's the difference between those approaches?
It's tricky because a lot of the provinces that tend to have the better incentives also have the mandate. But basically, the mandate just requires that dealers sell a certain percentage of EVs and it increases over years. And I think it's smart because we're not just going to hit those targets magically, when the time comes. So this is a way to sort of ensure the vehicles are on lots and growing over time. And so that definitely will help. I mean, incentives we know help. We've seen it. But there's other ways to do it. So for example, you could do it the way they do it in the United States, which is sort of by way of a tax credit rather than an actual cash incentive. That works just as well and tends to be favored in conservative circles. So I think, maybe that's an approach that we could take here in Ontario. We're going to have to do something to compete with the American approach. And also we could do things to make it easier, for example, to install charging, which also would help. And maybe Travis knows more about that than me.
Yeah, I mean, the economic justification for an incentive, Craig, is kind of twofold typically. So the first justification is there has long been what we call sort of the purchase price differential between EVs and ICE and internal combustion engine vehicles. And so the main justification has always been that we want consumers not to be deterred by the higher upfront price of EVs that has historically been there because we know that they're going to save on the operational end. And if you look at studies that look at how people's finances work when they buy an EV, they often save a very significant amount of money over 3, 5, 8 years, increasingly if they drive more. So that was sort of part one. Part two was really about getting consumers excited, because there's a recognition that it is a significant decision to move from the traditional vehicle that we've been using for a really long time to this new type of vehicle. And so we wanted to get consumers excited. And that's sort of been the historical justification for incentives. And I think that there's still a basis for doing that. The ZEV mandate is really focused on making sure there's adequate supply for the consumer demand. And we do see that most jurisdictions that have attained really high levels of ZEV adoption, California, British Columbia, Quebec, they all have ZEV sales requirements or mandates. And I think that's part of the justification that's been there. But one point I want to really make is that I have never heard anybody promoting a ZEV mandate without an incentive. Like, there's always a desire to make sure that you are helping consumers. And that is something that most folks agree on, is that if we want people to adopt at scale, we need to give them incentives, we need to give them education, we need to make sure the charging is there until we get to higher levels of adoption where some of those things can fall away. So those are probably, that's how I see those policies interacting.
Thanks for clarifying that. We're almost out of time, but I want to finish with one rapid fire question around the table. I want to know, in terms of priorities, we talked about priorities earlier. So if I'm going to ask you if you had one ask for, governments at any level, or one piece of advice to businesses who are thinking about where they go next on this, to help accelerate EV readiness, what would that be?
Yeah, I think I would go back to our Pathways to Decarbonization report and the no regrets options. I think, transportation electrification is going to drive a significant amount of demand for new clean electricity in the province, as we've talked about over the last little while. And there are a number of actions that we can and should get started on today to make sure that we're ready for that electrification, as well as all the other electric demand that we are forecasting associated with decarbonization, broader electrification. So those no regrets options, including beginning to plan, site, and do the environmental assessment work for new nuclear, long duration storage, hydroelectric facilities, and the associated transmission infrastructure, investing in emerging technologies like low carbon fuels that are going to help us solve the challenge, and building the collaboration amongst all of the organizations that we've talked about that are going to play a role in ensuring that we can meet the need.
I was trying to wait Cara out, but
I was like clicking at the same time. I'm like, well, I'll go if you want, Travis. So look, it's so hard to pick one thing, but what I would say is, if I had like a dream wish, and it isn't really one, but it's like to make the rules consistent across the whole country, because it's so complicated, and that's probably a multi-pronged ask, but in terms of incentives, in terms of sales requirements, in terms of like even how to get chargers installed, there's so much inconsistency across the country that actually costs everyone a lot of time and money. And I feel like if there was one, thing that would be the best, but it's probably many more than one thing when you really go down to it. But that would be my dream ask.
And I mean, I love yours, Cara, and I wish I had said it first. Here's the other thing that I would say. I think that the transition is coming faster than we maybe thought it would, and that's been a consistent theme throughout my career in this industry. And what I have found to be the case is that typically electrical systems participants and officials in government are very, very good when they have a clear forecast of sales to plan around. Like when there is clear direction from the top, this is how many ZEVs will be sold in this province or in this country, and this is what we're planning for. People are really good at doing their jobs. The challenge is when they lack that direction. And so if there's one thing that I think moves the needle more than almost anything else, it is having that clear direction on, we will have this many ZEV sales and we're going to plan for it and we're going to make it work. And then I genuinely believe our systems will respond accordingly. So
great pieces of insight and advice from all of you. We know that the climate economy is going to have a critical role for electric vehicles to play in this. And so it's great to hear that there are such thoughtful and wise people working on this from all these perspectives. So Cara, Katherine, Travis, thank you so much for joining us today. And take care.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much.
If that chat didn't rev you up with EV readiness enthusiasm, I don't know what will. This wraps our second episode of the Hit Go Climate Economy podcast. Please let us know how the show's changing your understanding of climate action with a review. If you haven't already, subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And if someone you know is connected to EVs, please share it, or to your entire social network. And don't forget to tag us if you do. Thanks for listening. We look forward to you joining us next time on Hit Go.
This is Story Studio Network.